My name is Dmitry Volkov. For 42 years, I have been the sole guardian of a creature humanity believes to be a myth. I did not hunt him, I did not capture him, I protected him. A wounded soul high in the Tian Shan range, where the borders of Kyrgyzstan and China blur into ice and silence. Now, that silence is broken by the crackle of military radios and the crunch of boots on snow that are not my own. Russian soldiers are here, and the promise I made in silence is about to be broken with the sound of gunfire. You need to know the truth before they find him. You need to know the truth before they rewrite it with blood and lies. This is not a story I want to tell. It is a confession I must. The mountain knows my secrets, and soon, so will you. This all began in 1980. I was a senior Soviet climatologist stationed at a high-altitude research outpost, a ghost facility even back then. Forgotten by the Union. My credibility is not in my words, but in the world I survived. It's etched into the brittle glacier maps I still possess. Charts of ice that has long since vanished. It's in the specific, high-pitched whine the wind makes as it whips past the derelict radio antenna at -40 degrees. You cannot fake the sound of deep ice cracking under your feet, a sound like God snapping a bone. You cannot imagine the oppressive, heavy silence that falls just before a whiteout blizzard erases the world. That silence was my only companion for a long, long time. It was a silence I had earned. My presence here was not an assignment. It was a defection, not for politics. I never cared for flags. It was a defection from guilt. I was part of a project in Leningrad, a terrible one, that twisted science into something profane. When I understood what we were building, I fled. I ran as far and as high as I could, leaving my career, my country, and my family behind. A ghost in the machine, then a ghost in the mountains. I chose this frozen, unforgiving isolation as my penance. I believed if I could live out my days in a place untouched by human ambition, I could atone for my part in it. I was wrong. My penance had a name, I just didn't know it yet. My routine was a sacrament of monotony, a way to keep madness at bay. At dawn, I'd check the meteorological sensors, my fingers stiff and clumsy in the cold. I'd maintain the temperamental pressure stove that kept me from freezing in my sleep. For an hour each night, I would listen to the static on the shortwave radio, hunting for a voice, any voice, in the crackling ether. It was a life measured in barometric pressure and dwindling fuel canisters. The silence was absolute, a physical weight on my chest. I thought this was how I would die. A forgotten man in a forgotten place, my bones eventually swallowed by the glacier. Some doors, I believed, should never be opened again. Then one evening, the silence was shattered. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the ice. It was a sound that did not belong. A deep, guttural, ragged sound of breathing. It was a sound of immense pain, and it was close. Every instinct screamed at me to bolt the door, to feed the stove, to pretend I'd heard nothing. This place was not meant for two living things, but the sound was not a roar of aggression. It was a plea, a desperate, liquid rattle that spoke of a life being extinguished. Against all reason, I pulled on my furs, grabbed my storm lantern, and stepped out into the crushing cold. The sound of my own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I followed the noise, my boots sinking into the freshly fallen snow. There, in the blue light of the falling dusk, I found him. He was just a juvenile then, but still immense, a primate of a kind I'd never seen, covered in thick, matted fur the color of winter clouds. He was slumped against a rock outcropping, and his leg was caught, mangled in the rusted steel teeth of a forgotten bear trap, a cruel relic from an age of hunters, left here to wait. The snow around the trap was stained dark. He wasn't struggling anymore. He was simply breathing, those awful, shallow breaths, waiting for the end. He was still a child, and he was dying. I could feel the cold seeping into my own bones just looking at him. The cold was wrong. He lifted his head as my lantern light fell across him. I saw his eyes, and the world stopped. They were not the simple, panicked eyes of a wild animal. They were ancient, profoundly intelligent, and filled with a desperate, weary exhaustion that I recognized in my own soul. There was no aggression in that gaze, no threat, just a deep, resonant awareness. He looked at me, and I felt as though he could see every shameful secret I had carried up this mountain. He knew who I was. In that moment, he was not a beast or a myth. He was a person, and he was in agony. The mountain held its breath, waiting to see what I would do, and that was my choice, my first true test. Helping him meant exposing my location, my very existence. A creature like that, its discovery would bring the world crashing down on this sanctuary. It would bring the very people I was hiding from. Leaving him to die, however, meant becoming the monster I was running from. It meant agreeing that my survival was worth more than his life. It meant I was no different from the men in Leningrad, the ones who signed papers and condemned others to unseen fates. I had fled to escape my complicity in suffering. And here it was, offered to me again in a new form. This was my sin, given a face and a name I couldn't yet speak. I made my choice, a promise made in silence. I knelt in the snow, my own breath pluming in the frigid air. I slowly, carefully, used the tools I had to pry open the rusted jaws of the trap. It took all my strength, my muscles screaming in the thin air, the metal groaning in protest. He watched me the entire time, his dark eyes never leaving my face. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, aside from that terrible, pained breathing. When his leg was finally free, a mangled ruin of flesh and bone, I used my own precious medical supplies to clean and bind the wound as best I could. I left him a bowl of the warm stew I had hoarded for myself and retreated to my hut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. As I worked on his wound, I found something that made no sense. Embedded deep in the tissue, near the bone, was a shard of metal. It wasn't a piece of the trap. It was smooth, dark, and completely non-reflective. I pulled it free with my forceps, and the moment it touched my glove, I felt a cold so profound, so unnatural, it was like holding a piece of the void. It wasn't the cold of the mountain. It was an absence of heat, a deadness that seemed to drink the warmth from my fingers. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than the wind, that this strange, cold shard was the real reason for his wound. The trap had just been a cruel coincidence. I slipped it into my pocket, a cold weight against my thigh. That night began everything. I had made a choice, and in doing so, I had tied my fate to his. I had chosen to intervene, to risk everything for a stranger, and to keep his existence a secret from a world that would only seek to destroy him. My isolation was no longer a penance. It had become a duty. The silence I kept was no longer for me, but for him. I am telling you this now because the soldiers are getting closer, and I can hear their seismic sensors pinging against the deep rock. The silence is about to be broken forever. If you believe a story like this deserves to be heard, if you believe the truth matters more than the official record, then please, do me a favor. Like this recording, subscribe so others can find it, and share it with someone you trust. And please, stay with me until the end. You need to know what they are really hunting. The next morning, I awoke to a silence that felt heavier, more profound than before. The world was holding its breath. I expected to find him gone, or worse, to find his body finally succumb to the cold. With a knot of dread in my stomach, I forced myself to the door. The snow was disturbed. A clear trail of a heavy body dragging itself away from my hut and towards the high rocks. The small stew bowl was gone. There was no blood, only the deep impressions in the snow, a silent testament to his impossible will to survive. I was alone again, but the nature of my solitude had fundamentally changed. I was no longer just a hermit. I was now a witness. The mountain knows what happened next. It was the start of everything. I followed his tracks to the rock outcropping where I had found him. The tracks continued on, up into a labyrinth of stone and ice where I couldn't follow. But there, in the exact spot where I had left the bowl of stew, was a single object placed with obvious care. It was a stone, perfectly smooth and dark as a starless night, worn by 1,000 years in a river that had long since frozen over. I picked it up. It was cold, yes, but it was the clean, honest cold of the mountain, not the vampiric chill of the metal shard still hidden in my pocket. This was not a random rock. Its placement, its perfect form. It was a gesture. It was a trade, a quiet, dignified acknowledgement. It was the first word in a language we would invent together. I understood then. This was not a one-time rescue. It was an invitation. My monotonous routine, the sacrament of my penance, was broken. A new purpose began to dawn in the frozen landscape of my life. That afternoon, I didn't just maintain my equipment. I prepared another meal, a larger one, using the last of my precious dried meat. There was risk in this, a deep folly in sharing my meager supplies with a myth. But the risk of returning to that hollow, silent existence was now far greater. For the first time in years, I was not just surviving the day, I was anticipating the next one. This was my atonement, taking a new shape I couldn't have predicted. I was no longer just running from my past. I was building a new, secret present. I needed a safer place for our exchange, a neutral ground. I found it a few hundred meters away, the wide, sheltered mouth of a cave system, etched into the base of a glacier. The entrance was large enough for him to pass through comfortably, and it was protected from the wind. It felt right. It was a threshold between my world and his. I placed the food just inside the entrance, where the morning sun could touch it, and then I retreated. I made a conscious choice not to step a single pace further into the darkness. That was the first rule of our pact, established without a word. I would not invade his home. I would respect the boundary. This small patch of ground became our sanctuary, our embassy. The next day, the food was gone. In its place was another offering, a fossil, a perfect spiral ammonite, something that belonged to the floor of a prehistoric ocean, not 3,000 meters up in a mountain range. The sheer impossibility of it stole my breath. Where had he found it? Had he kept it? Did he understand what it was? The questions piled up, each one a new layer to the mystery. But the core message was clear. The exchange was accepted. The pact was sealed. This was our ritual now. I would bring food, a token of my world's fragile warmth, and he would leave a piece of his, a fragment of the mountain's deep and ancient memory. Our silent conversation had begun. The second rule was established a few weeks later. One night, a brutal cold snap forced me to run my diesel generator, a luxury I rarely afforded myself. The machine sputtered to life with a loud motif-fade mechanical roar, a sound of grinding metal and foul smoke that was a profanity in this silent place. As the hut's single bulb flickered on, I glanced out the reinforced window. I caught a flash of movement, a massive white shape, visible for a split second against the dark rock, retreating with a speed that was shocking. He had been nearby, perhaps watching, but the noise of my machine had driven him away. The lesson was instant and absolute. He would not, could not, abide the sounds of my old world. From that day on, I used the generator only in the most dire emergencies. Silence was a price of this peace. In the long, quiet hours of the Arctic night, my own secret burned in my pocket. I would take out the metal shard I had pulled from his leg and study it under the lantern light. It was an enigma, barely 5 centimeters long, impossibly dense, with an edge so fine it felt like it could cleave reality itself. It never frosted over. It never warmed to my touch. It felt dead, but an active kind of dead, a cold that seemed to draw heat into itself and simply erase it. It was a product of a technology far beyond what I had worked on, yet it felt horribly familiar in its purpose. I knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in my gut, that this shard was the key. His wound wasn't from a hunter's trap. It was from a cage of a different, more terrible kind. About a month into our ritual, the most definitive message arrived. I went to the cave mouth with my usual offering and stopped dead. There, laid out neatly on the flat rock where I left the food, were the pieces of the old bear trap. It wasn't just dragged there, it was methodically and completely dismantled. The powerful steel spring was uncoiled. The serrated jaws were separated from the trigger plate. The chain was unlinked. This was not the work of an animal. It required immense strength, yes, but also a fine analytical intelligence, a deep understanding of mechanical objects. It was a statement, a postscript to his injury. He was telling me, a problem has been solved. This threat is gone. It was his way of closing a chapter and of showing me, without a doubt, that I was not dealing with a simple creature. His gifts began to change after that. They became less about curiosity and more about care. For weeks, I had been plagued by splitting headaches, a common and dangerous affliction of high altitude. I had run out of medication. One morning, instead of a stone or a fossil, I found a bundle of green stems and leaves, tied together with a strand of what looked like his own hair. I recognized the plant instantly from old botanical surveys of the region, a rare mountain herb known to the Kyrgyz tribes as stonebreaker, a potent remedy for altitude sickness. I had searched for it for years without success. He had not only found it, but understood what I needed. He was watching me. He was caring for me. He was returning my initial act of aid in kind. The most stunning proof of his intellect, the act that forever erased any doubt, came that first winter. I was planning a new, more dangerous route to check a malfunctioning sensor across a vast, unstable glacier field. The next morning, I found the snow in front of his cave marked with a series of deep, deliberate lines and curves. It was a drawing. For a moment, I stared, uncomprehending. Then, a jolt went through me. I recognized the shapes. It was a map. A perfect top-down view of the glacier I intended to cross. And over one specific, wide, innocent-looking patch of snow, he had gouged a massive X. It was a warning. A promise made in silence is a promise you learn to trust. I took a different route. From a high ridge later that day, I looked back and saw that the area he had marked had collapsed, revealing a crevasse so wide and deep it could have swallowed my entire hut. He had saved my life. Our ritual was now the beating heart of my existence. It was a silent language of survival and respect. I provided food, salt, and the occasional comfort of a warm meal. In return, he provided knowledge that no map or satellite could offer. He was the mountain's eyes and ears, and he was sharing his senses with me. He would leave strange, twisted pieces of metal, debris from old satellites, I presumed, always pointing in the direction of an approaching storm. He would leave a single feather from a snow eagle on days when the avalanche risk was highest. He was teaching me to read the mountain not as a scientist, but as a resident. He was showing me how to truly belong here, in the one place on Earth we could both call home. My curiosity about his world, the dark, silent interior of the cave, became a constant, gnawing temptation, to see where he slept, to understand how he survived in the deep cold. One afternoon, emboldened by months of peaceful exchange, I took a single, fateful step past the threshold, out of the sunlight and into the chilling gloom of the cave. Sound of a low, resonant growl, more like a vibrating rock than an animal. The sound hit me not in the ears, but in the chest. It was not a sound of anger. It was a sound of immense, bottomless warning. It was the voice of the mountain itself, telling me I had reached a border I must not cross. This far, and no further. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering. The rule was now spoken, in his own way. His home was his own. I contented myself with observing him from a distance, through my old pair of military binoculars. The juvenile I had rescued was vanishing, replaced by a being of awe-inspiring power. The limp was gone, replaced by a fluid, silent gait. I watched him navigate sheer ice cliffs with a grace that seemed to ignore gravity, his massive form moving with the certainty of flowing water. I saw him stand motionless for hours on a high ridge, facing into a blizzard that would have frozen me solid in minutes, a silent, white sentinel against the raging gray sky. He was not hiding in these mountains, I began to realize, with a dawning sense of dread and wonder, that he was guarding them. Some doors should never be opened, and he was the keeper of the lock. The years began to pass in this strange, shared solitude. A decade, then two. My hair turned from gray to white. The lines on my face deepened like the crevasses on the glacier. Our ritual was the one constant in a world of ice and wind, but the peace we had built was fragile, a secret whispered in a hurricane. The shard of metal I kept hidden was a perpetual reminder of an outside world that created such things. Every distant drone of a jet engine, every flicker of a satellite crossing the night sky, sent a fresh spike of fear through me. I knew this couldn't last. The world I had so desperately fled has a long memory and an insatiable appetite. My penance, I finally understood, wasn't the isolation itself. It was these years of peace. It was the calm before the inevitable, terrible storm. The bond we forged in that first year became the bedrock of the next 20. Time flows differently in the high mountains. Seasons are events, not calendars. I watched him grow, the gangly adolescent frame filling out with immense, powerful muscle. The white fur of his youth thickened, becoming a magnificent coat that shimmered in the alpine sun. Our silent language evolved. He learned the rhythm of my own body, the slump in my shoulders that meant exhaustion, the quickness of my step that spoke of a good day. Once, laid low by a fever that left me too weak to even fetch water, I awoke to find a perfectly carved bowl of ice, filled with clean meltwater, sitting just outside my door. He had broken his own rule of never approaching the hut, a small transgression that screamed of deep, abiding care. It was a gesture that saved me from a dangerous dehydration, a quiet acknowledgement that our pact was more than just survival. It was now kinship. There were moments of startling, shared humanity that I cannot explain with science. One night, a powerful atmospheric duct allowed my shortwave radio to pick up a broadcast from Tashkent, a faint and ghostly thread of sound. It was Tchaikovsky, a symphony I remembered from my youth in Leningrad, a lifetime away. I sat in the dark, my eyes closed, letting the music wash over me. I felt a presence and opened my eyes. On the ridge opposite my hut, his massive silhouette was still against the stars. He wasn't hiding. He was sitting, his head tilted slightly, as if listening. He stayed there for the entire broadcast, a silent, motionless audience sharing this fragile connection to a world we had both left behind. When the music faded back into static, he stood, gave a slow look towards my hut, and vanished into the darkness. We had shared something more than food or warnings. We had shared a moment of beauty. The first crack in our sanctuary appeared on a clear summer morning. I heard them before I saw them. The faint clink of carabiners and the echo of foreign voices, sharp and cheerful in the thin air. A team of international mountaineers, 4 of them, were making their way up the main valley. My blood ran cold. This was the first human intrusion in over a decade. I retreated into my hut, my heart a frantic drum, my binoculars glued to my eyes. My fear was not for myself, but for him. How would he react? Would he panic? Would he reveal himself? The world I had built was a house of cards, and a single gust of wind was blowing through the valley. The silence from the high rocks was absolute, but I knew he was there, watching. My atonement was about to be put to its greatest test. For 3 days and 3 nights, as the climbers made their slow ascent, he did not move. I tracked him with my binoculars, a statue of white fur tucked into a shadow high on the cliffs, 1,000 meters above them. He became part of the mountain. He didn't eat, he didn't sleep. He simply watched with a discipline that was terrifying in its perfection. Any animal would have been spooked, would have fled and left a trail. He simply ceased to exist. I, on the other hand, barely breathed for those 3 days. I was a nervous wreck, living on cold rations, terrified to even light my stove for fear the smoke would be seen. This was his territory, and he was showing a mastery of it that humbled me. He was not an animal hiding from predators. He was a king observing peasants crossing his domain. The promise made in silence was one of patience. On the 3rd day, the climbers began their descent. I felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. They were leaving. Our secret was safe. But as they passed through a lower section of the valley, one of them stopped. He pointed at the ground, calling his companions over. The snow had been melting under the strong sun, and a patch of mud was exposed. I trained my binoculars on the spot, my hands shaking. There, perfectly preserved in the soft earth, was one of his footprints. A single, massive, undeniable print. One of the climbers pulled out a camera. The flash felt like a gunshot in the silent valley. They took pictures, gesturing with excitement, their voices carrying on the wind. They didn't know what they had found, not really, but they had captured a piece of the secret. The mountain knows that a photograph is a seed, and I knew nothing good would grow from it. The silence that returned after they left was different. It was tainted. Months passed, and the dread in my gut slowly hardened into a permanent knot. I began to scan the shortwave radio frequencies more frantically, not for music, but for news. Then I heard it, not on a major broadcast, but on a low-power enthusiast channel, a program for cryptid hunters and anomaly chasers. They were talking about a photograph, a single, clear print from the Tian Shan range, posted on a mountaineering blog. They were calling him the Tian Shan Yeti, giving him a label, a target. They debated its authenticity. They planned expeditions. My secret, our secret, was now a piece of public data, a topic for discussion by faceless voices in the dark. The world I had fled was finally turning its gaze back towards my sanctuary. It took another year, but they came. Not a team of scientists, but one man, an oak adventurer, the radio chatter had called him. He came alone, but he brought the modern world with him. He had satellite phones, GPS trackers, and a drone. The sound of it was the most obscene violation I had yet endured. A high-pitched, synthetic whine, like a mechanical hornet, buzzing over the sacred stillness of the ridges. It flew with an arrogant impunity, its camera eye swiveling, scanning, hunting. I watched from my hut, my fists clenched, feeling utterly powerless. This was a new kind of hunter, one who sought not a trophy of fur and bone, but one of pixels and fame. He was hunting a legend, and I was trapped, unable to do anything but watch him desecrate our home with his noise and his ambition. But I was not the only one who found the drone's presence intolerable. As the machine made a low pass over the ridge leading to his caves, a strange thing happened. A sound began, but it was also a feeling. A low-frequency hum that vibrated up from the soles of my feet, through the floor of my hut, and into my bones. It was the sound of the mountain itself groaning. Out on the ridge, the drone faltered. Its confident buzz became an erratic, panicked whine. It wobbled in the air, its rotors struggling against a force they were not designed for. Then, with a final, pathetic shriek of dying electronics, it spiraled out of control and crashed into a deep, inaccessible ravine miles away. Silence returned, more profound than ever. He had protected our home. He had swatted the insect without showing his hand. But I knew this victory would only make the man more determined. Frustrated by the loss of his expensive toy, the hunter became reckless. He abandoned the safe routes and began climbing in a dangerous, unstable sector known for rockfalls, a place I had warned him about in my mind 1,000 times. He was chasing a ghost, blinded by ego. Then, the sound I had been dreading echoed through the valley. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was a human voice, shouting in pain, followed by a clatter of falling rock and then a terrible silence. I grabbed my binoculars. I found him, a small dark shape crumpled at the base of a scree slope, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. He was alive, but he was trapped. The sun was setting. The temperature was already plummeting. He would be dead by morning. The mountain held its breath, presenting me with the same choice it had given me all those years ago. Leave him and protect the secret, or help him, and risk everything. There was no choice, not really. To let him die would be to become the monster I had run from. It would make a mockery of the mercy he had been shown, and the mercy he had shown me. My penance was not a passive hiding. It was an active protection of life, all life, in my small kingdom. I packed a small bag with my remaining medical supplies, splints, and thermal blankets. As I stepped out of the hut, into the deepening twilight, I looked up towards the high ridges where he lived. I couldn't see him, but I felt his eyes on me. I felt his understanding. This was the price. The promise made in silence had always been about choosing compassion over fear. Now, I had to honor it, even for an enemy. I began the treacherous journey down towards the injured man, my heart heavy with the knowledge that our world was about to break open. I reached him in the dark. He was delirious with pain and cold, barely conscious. He flinched when he saw me, his eyes wide with fear. An old man with a white beard, appearing out of the darkness like a ghost of the mountain. I didn't speak. Words were a luxury we couldn't afford. I worked quickly, setting his broken leg in a crude splint, forcing warm tea from my thermos between his chattering teeth. He was a fool, and he was my guest, and he was my responsibility. The hardest part was getting him moved. He was a heavy man, and I was old. I had to half drag, half carry him for 2 kilometers to a small emergency shelter used by park rangers on the far side of the border, a place I knew was checked periodically. I activated its emergency beacon, a single pulse that would bring help, and then I vanished back into the night, leaving him to be found. The cost of that night's mercy was my anonymity. The rescued hunter told a rambling, feverish story to the authorities, of a giant, ghostly beast in the snow, of a drone that fell from the sky, and of a silent, phantom-like old man who saved his life and disappeared without a trace. The authorities dismissed the Quolbistok as hallucination, but they could not dismiss the rescuer. Search parties combed the area. Official radio traffic now crackled with a new urgency. They knew, with certainty, that there was an unregistered inhabitant in this sector. An anomaly. A loose thread in their neatly mapped world. The next people to come here would not be tourists or fools with drones. They would be professionals, men with orders. I had saved a life, but in doing so, I had lit a fire that was now burning its way towards my door. Some doors should never be opened, and I had just kicked one wide open for the whole world to see. The quiet that followed the hunter's rescue was a sick, thin thing. The years of true peace were over. It felt like living under a cracked pane of glass, waiting for it to finally shatter. I became a ghost in my own home, startled by the sound of the wind, scrutinizing the horizon for any sign of approach. The radio brought only static and the gnawing fear of what the rescued man's story might set in motion. I was an old man now, my bones aching with a permanent chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was my 37th winter in the Tian Shan, and it was the winter when the mountain finally decided to collect its debt. I knew my atonement was not a passive act of hiding. It was a bill that would one day come due, and I could feel my time to pay was drawing near. I had built a sanctuary on a foundation of lies and silence, and the first tremors were beginning to shake it apart. The mountain knows that all sanctuaries are temporary. It happened on a day of brutal, clear sky cold. The ice underfoot was like black glass. I was returning from checking a distant sensor, my thoughts turned inward, lost in the paranoid maze of my own making. One moment I was walking, the next I was flying, and then there was only a single, blinding spike of pain. I heard a sound, a wet, sickening crack, that was not the ice but my own body. My left leg was twisted beneath me, the femur shattered. I knew it instantly. It was a death sentence. I was miles from my hut, the sun already dipping behind the peaks. The cold, the real killing cold, began its work immediately, a physical entity seeping into my clothes, my skin, my blood. Lying there, staring up at the indifferent violet sky, I felt a strange sense of resignation. This was the end I had always expected, just not today. My penance was to die alone, my secrets freezing with me. I must have passed out. When I came to, it was dusk. The pain was a living thing, a bonfire in my leg, but the cold was worse, a creeping paralysis that had stolen all feeling from my hands and feet. This is how he must have felt, I thought, all those years ago in the teeth of that trap. Alone and waiting for the end. I was preparing to let go, to slide into the final, dreamless sleep, when a shadow fell over me. I blinked, my vision blurry with frost. A massive form stood over me, blocking out the last of the light. A silhouette of impossible size and power. It was him. He had broken our most sacred rule. He had come for me. I saw his eyes in the gloom, and in them I saw not an animal, but an intelligence filled with a familiar, urgent concern. A promise made in silence was about to be honored in the most profound way possible. He knelt, the snow compressing with a soft sigh under his immense weight. He did not make a sound. He simply reached for me. I braced for a rough, animalistic handling, but his touch was unbelievably gentle. His massive dapoo, fur-covered hands slid beneath my back and legs, supporting my shattered limb with a surgeon's care. He lifted me as if I weighed nothing, my broken body cradled against his chest. The smell of him was the smell of cold stone, of ozone, and of clean, wild fur. There was no foul animal musk, only the scent of the mountain itself. As he began to walk, his gait was smooth, impossibly so, gliding over the treacherous ice and snow that had crippled me. I was a child in the arms of a giant. The entire world was inverted. The helpless creature I had once saved was now my savior, carrying me back towards the life I had been ready to abandon. In my pain-ridden haze, I understood. This was not just a rescue. This was a reckoning of our bond. He carried me all the way to my hut. He nudged the door open with his shoulder and, breaking another sacred rule, leaned inside to place me gently on my bunk next to the cold, dead stove. He did not step inside. The threshold was still a border he respected. He backed away, his dark eyes holding mine for a long moment, an unreadable expression on his ancient face. Then he was gone. I lay there shivering, drifting in and out of consciousness, the pain a constant, roaring tide. I knew I would not survive the night. The hut was already an icebox, the temperature inside plummeting to match the world outside. I could not reach the stove, could not reach my fuel. I had been brought to my deathbed. I closed my eyes, listening to the wind howl its funeral dirge. My last thought was of his eyes, filled not with pity, but with purpose. I awoke not to death, but to a strange, profound warmth. The wall beside my bunk, the thin metal sheeting that faced the outside, was warm to the touch. Not hot, but radiating a steady, living heat that pushed back the killing cold. I heard a sound through the wall, a deep, slow, rhythmic breathing, like a great bellows. I dragged myself to the frosted window and wiped a clear patch with my sleeve. There he was. He was lying against the outside of my hut, his immense body pressed against the thin wall, a living furnace, a guardian against the night. For 2 days and 2 nights, as I shivered with fever and pain, he did not leave. He laid his body against my shelter, sharing his impossible vitality, a constant, silent presence that kept me tethered to the world of the living. He was giving his life force to me, a transfusion of warmth and will that defied all logic. On the second night, in a moment of delirious clarity, a face appeared in the patch of glass I kept clear. It was his. He was holding up a shard of perfectly clear ice, like a pane of glass. He angled it, and in it, I saw my own haggard, pale reflection. He held it steady for a moment, then pointed a single, massive finger at my reflection in the ice. Then, he moved the finger to his own broad, fur-covered chest, and finally, he lifted his arm and pointed, with an unwavering, deliberate intensity, not just to the sky, but specifically to the north, toward the pole star that glittered like a diamond on black velvet. My reflection, him, the northern sky, my fevered brain raced, the gesture replaying in my mind, a piece of silent, stark communication that felt like the most important words I had ever heard. He wasn't just showing me something, he was telling me who he was. The pieces crashed together in my mind with the force of an avalanche. The cold shard of metal I had pulled from his leg 40 years ago, the one still hidden in my chest, a cold that felt like the vacuum of space. The unnatural cold, his constant, obsessive watchfulness of the northern horizon. The drone, swatted from the sky not just in anger, but with a specific energy, as if he were protecting something from a specific kind of seeing. And the patterns he would draw in the snow, the ones I had mistaken for art. I saw them now for what they were. Not random scribbles, but schematics, star charts, diagrams of something complex and alien. He wasn't an animal who had learned to be smart. He was an intelligence that had been forced to act like an animal. He was a castaway, or worse, he was a guard. He was not hiding in these mountains. He was a sentinel. This entire range was his watchtower, and he had been on duty for a very, very long time. My penance, my self-imposed isolation, was a cosmic joke. I hadn't run to the most remote place on Earth to hide from humanity. I had run to the one place where a duty far older and more important than my own was being carried out in secret. My role in this was not to atone for my past, but to become an accomplice to his present. My atonement had a name, a purpose I was only just beginning to grasp. I was the Keeper's companion, the Guardian's witness. And the thing he was guarding was so terrible, or so precious, that he had endured this solitude for centuries. Waiting. Waiting for what? Or for whom? The truth was a weight far heavier than the mountain. My leg healed, but I was forever changed. The fracture in my bone was nothing compared to the fracture in my understanding of the world. Our ritual of exchange continued, but it was different now. The hierarchy was gone. I was no longer a man caring for a creature. We were partners, 2 old soldiers garrisoned at the quietest, most forgotten outpost in the universe. The intimacy of his rescue, the feeling of his warmth through the wall, had forged a bond that transcended species, that transcended words. The fear of being discovered by mountaineers or adventurers now seemed laughably small. A new, much larger fear took its place, the fear of the people he was watching for finally arriving. Some doors should never be opened, and I now realized I was living on the doorstep of the most important one on Earth. That moment at the window was a gift, a glimpse behind the veil. He trusted me with a fraction of his truth, and now that truth is a part of me, it is the reason I am recording this. The peace is over. The real enemy, the one he has been watching for, is finally coming. I can hear them now, not with my ears, but with the same instinct that he taught me to trust. The silence is different. It's the silence of a held breath before a scream. What happened next will test your belief in everything you think you know about our world, our history, and our place in it. I am asking you to keep listening, to bear witness with me. If you believe this story needs to be preserved, please, like this recording, subscribe to this channel, and share it. The truth of what is hidden in these mountains is more important than my life, and it's a truth they are coming to bury forever. Stay with me. It did not begin with a storm of helicopters or the roar of engines. It began with a change in the static. For a week, my shortwave radio picked up disciplined, encrypted bursts of communication on frequencies that should have been dead. They were close. The sounds of the mountain shifted, too. The familiar sigh of wind through the pass was now occasionally punctuated by a sharp, metallic click I couldn't place. The snow eagles that circled the high peaks vanished. Animals know. They feel the presence of a new, apex predator long before it shows its face. I felt it too, a low hum of anxiety in my teeth, a feeling of being watched not by one pair of ancient eyes, but by many, all of them cold and human. My sanctuary had become a hunting ground, and for the first time in 42 years, I felt like the prey. He was silent. Up on his ridges, there was no movement, no sign. He knew, too. The silence we had shared for so long was no longer a comfort. It had become a shared, bated breath. The promise made in silence was now a conspiracy. The proof came on a Tuesday. I found it nestled near the base of a rock on one of my old supply routes, a discarded nutrient paste wrapper. The text was Cyrillic, the design stark and military grade, nothing you could buy in a store. Beside it, almost invisible against the gray stone, was a single, brass-cased shell. It was from a rifle I didn't recognize, short, thick, and designed for silent, subsonic velocity. This was not a hunter's camp. This was the work of professionals, of ghosts who moved without a trace and left only whispers behind. They were not here by accident. They were methodical. They were quiet. I pocketed the shell casing, the metal cold against my skin, a stark contrast to the living cold of the shard I still carried. One was a tool of my past, the other a mystery of my present, and I knew, with a certainty that made me sick, that the two were about to meet. The world I fled had found my address, and it had sent its most efficient messengers to deliver the mail. My penance was no longer a quiet solitude. It was an active, terrified vigilance. 2 days later, they came to my door, two men, dressed in winter camouflage that made them flicker at the edge of my vision. They didn't knock. The leader, a man half my age with eyes as cold and empty as a glacier's heart, simply stood there until I opened the door. He held a small black tablet in his gloved hand. My own face, younger, thinner, stared back at me from the screen, a grainy photo from a file buried for half a century. The man's lips barely moved, a faint puff of condensation the only sign of life. "Comrade Volkov," he said. The words were not a question. They were a statement of fact. A key turning in a lock I had thought rusted shut forever. The name, a name I had not heard spoken aloud in 42 years, struck me with physical force. It was the sound of my tomb being unsealed. I was no longer a hermit, no longer a phantom. I was Dmitry Volkov, a ghost dragged back into the light, and my past had come to collect its due. The mountain held its breath, knowing this was a moment from which there was no retreat. He introduced himself as Major Kurchatov. He said they were not here for me, not for my political disagreements with the Union. My file was a footnote, a historical curiosity. They were here for state property. He spoke with the bored efficiency of a man filing paperwork. "We are here to recover a lost asset," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "Project Svarog." The name from my nightmares, the project that had sent me fleeing to the highest, coldest place on Earth. It was a deep-range acoustic resonance device, a doomsday weapon I had helped design, capable of triggering tectonic events or activating submarine fleets from halfway across the world with a single, targeted frequency. It was a whisper that could shatter continents. A transport plane carrying the only prototype crashed in this sector in the winter of 1980. They had been searching for it ever since. I wasn't a defector hiding from a government. I was a man who had built his house on top of a buried bomb. Their technology was a nightmare. Kurchatov showed me on his tablet a three-dimensional, translucent map of the mountain range, built from satellite data, ground-penetrating radar, and a network of seismic sensors they had been quietly planting for weeks. "We are mapping the subterranean cavities," he explained, his finger tracing a line that led directly toward the cave system. My friend's home. The asset is housed in a unique metal alloy that gives off a faint, residual energy signature. We've narrowed its location to this sector. My sanctuary, his home, the place of our silent communion, was just a green-shaded area on their tactical map, a point of interest labeled Anomaly. They were peeling the mountain apart, layer by layer, with signals and waves, and I was utterly, completely powerless to stop them. They weren't looking for a living thing. They were looking for a machine I had helped create. Some doors should never be opened, and I had handed them the key 40 years ago. The Major made his offer. It was not a negotiation. You have been here for 4 decades, Volkov. You know the caves, the crevasses, the unstable areas. Your knowledge could expedite this recovery. Cooperate. And your previous indiscretions can be permanently archived. Then he added the line that froze my soul. We have thermal readings of a large, undocumented primate nesting in the primary cave system. It is an obstacle, an animal. Help us, and we will ensure it is relocated without incident. Relocated. The word was so clean, so sterile. A bureaucratic euphemism for a bullet. They saw him as a bear in the way of their prize. A biological nuisance to be cleared. They had no idea, no concept of the intelligence in those eyes, the bond we shared, the duty he upheld. To them, he was just fur and muscle, an animal in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was a complication they would solve with brutal efficiency. My friend, my savior, my silent partner, reduced to a footnote in their mission briefing. I became the man they expected me to be, the mad hermit of the mountains. I feigned confusion, paranoia, a mind eroded by decades of isolation. I spoke of wind spirits and mountain ghosts, rambling nonsensically about the sounds the ice makes. I played the part of a useless relic, a man whose mind was as broken and frozen as the landscape. It was the most important performance of my life. Kurchatov watched me with a look of bored contempt, dismissing me as a dead end. But they did not leave. They placed a small, metallic disc, no bigger than a coin, on my doorframe. For your safety, the Major said. A perimeter alarm, so you don't wander into our operational area. I knew what it was. It was a listening device, a silent, digital ear to ensure the mad hermit didn't suddenly regain his senses. The paranoia was no longer a feeling. It was a physical weight, a constant companion in my own hut. Every creak of the floorboards was a potential betrayal. The ritual was broken. I could no longer go to the cave. To be seen anywhere near it would be a death sentence for him. The daily exchange, the rhythm that had governed my life for 42 years, ceased. The silence between us was now absolute, a void of fear and uncertainty. Did he understand? Did he know I was forced into this? Or did he think I had abandoned him? Every morning I looked towards the high rocks, searching for a sign, but there was nothing. He was deep, hidden, practicing the same perfect stillness he had shown with the mountaineers. But this time, the threat was infinitely greater. The absence of our connection was a physical ache, a hollow space in my chest. For the first time, I felt truly alone on the mountain. My promise made in silence was now a promise I had to break, praying he would understand that my absence was the only way I could protect him. I was a prisoner in my own home, the warden of a secret I could no longer share. The sounds of their work became the new pulse of the mountain. At night, I would see faint lights moving across distant ridges, methodical search patterns closing in. I could feel the seismic sensors through the floor of my hut, a faint, rhythmic pinging that vibrated deep in the rock. It was a countdown timer, each ping a step closer to his home. They were no longer searching, they were homing in. The green-shaded anomaly on their map was shrinking, the circle tightening around the one place I had sworn to protect. The paranoia became a fever. I began talking to myself, nonsense phrases, knowing they were listening, trying to reinforce my persona as a broken old man. I was a rat in a cage, watching the scientists prepare their instruments, knowing the experiment was about to reach its final, terrible stage. The mountain knew what was coming. It groaned under the assault of their technology, its ancient silence torn apart by their relentless quest. The full weight of my sin finally crashed down on me. I hadn't just fled from a project. I had left a monster sleeping in the wilderness and had spent 42 years living peacefully next to its cage. The cold shard of metal I carried, the key he had lost, was not just a piece of his history, it was a piece of mine. My penance wasn't the 42 years of lonely survival. That was a gift, that was a reprieve. My true penance was this moment, this impossible choice. I could stay silent, let them find Svarog, and unleash a weapon of unimaginable horror upon a world I no longer understood, all to protect the one friend I had, or I could betray him to stop them. My guilt was no longer a memory. It was an active participant in this crisis. The man who fled Leningrad to escape his complicity in creating a weapon was now the only person who could stop it, and the price might be the very soul he had spent a lifetime trying to save. The end began with silence, the rhythmic pinging of the seismic sensors. The heartbeat of my paranoia for weeks simply stopped. The quiet that rushed in to fill the void was not the peace of the mountain. It was the held breath of a predator before the strike. They had found it. They were at the mouth of his cave. My time for hiding, for playing the mad hermit, was over. I moved to the heavy footlocker where I kept my ghosts. My hands, trembling not with fear but with a terrible clarity, retrieved the old detonator box for the avalanche charges I'd placed decades ago. In my other pocket, the shard I took from his leg felt like a piece of dead star, its unnatural cold a reminder of a science that had no place in this world. I was no longer a witness. I was now the final variable in an equation I had helped write 42 years ago. I pulled on my furs one last time. The promise made in silence demanded one final, terrible sound. My atonement was at hand, and its name was absolution. I moved across the snow with the ghost-like familiarity of 4 decades. A phantom in my own backyard. I did not need light. I knew every rock, every treacherous sheet of ice. The wind was my accomplice, muffling the sound of my cautious steps. As I drew closer, I could see it. A cold, profane blue-white light spilling from the mouth of his cave. The glow of their chemical lamps, a sterile intrusion into the sacred darkness. I heard their voices, low and disciplined, Russian words muffled by the stone, the occasional metallic clank of equipment echoing softly in the vast stillness. This was it. The place of our silent ritual, our embassy of 2, was now a breach point, a scene of invasion. I crawled the final 100 meters on my belly, the detonator box clutched to my chest, my breath pluming and freezing in front of my face. The cold was no longer the enemy, it was my camouflage. I reached the ledge overlooking the entrance, my heart a slow, heavy hammer against my ribs, and I looked down into hell. The main cavern was lit like a surgical theater. 10 soldiers in white tactical gear formed a semicircle, their rifles raised, lasers painting a web of red dots on his chest. Major Kurchatov stood behind them, tablet in hand, his face a mask of predatory focus. And there, in the center of it all, was my friend. He was not cornered. He was not panicked. He stood with a stillness that was not of this world, his head high, his ancient eyes not on the soldiers, but on Kurchatov. He was not an animal caught in the headlights. He was a king, assessing the barbarians who had stormed his castle. The soldiers saw a beast, a trophy, a threat to be neutralized. I saw a being of immense, tragic dignity, standing on the precipice of a secret he had guarded for longer than any human empire had existed. He had carried his burden in solitude for centuries, and now the ignorant, greedy children of the world he hid from had come to rip it from his chest. They had no idea what they were doing. Then, he moved, not in aggression, not in fear. With a slow, deliberate grace, he turned his back on the soldiers and walked towards the far wall of the cavern, a sheer face of rock I had always assumed was a dead end. He reached out a massive, white-furred hand and pressed it flat against the stone. The low-frequency hum began, the same sound that had killed the drone, but this time it was infinitely more powerful. It vibrated through my bones, through the very rock I was lying on. The stone wall in front of him did not crumble, it shimmered. It became translucent, like smoked glass, revealing a deep cavity within the mountain itself. Inside, bathed in a soft internal light, was a machine, a console of the same dark, non-reflective metal as the shard in my pocket. A single, ominous red light blinked slowly, rhythmically, like a sleeping heart. Kurchatov gasped, a single, sharp intake of air that cut through the hum. "Incredible," he whispered. My friend, my guardian, reached into a fold of skin on his chest, a place he had always guarded, and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. From it, he produced the counterpart to the shard I held, another piece of that impossibly cold, dark metal. I finally understood. His wound, all those years ago, was not just an injury, it was a failure. He had lost a piece of himself, a piece of his function. He took the shard and slid it into a waiting slot on the console. The hum intensified, the entire mountain seeming to groan around me, and the single red light on the console turned to a steady, terrifying, brilliant green. Svarog was active, The whisper that could break the world was awake. Kurchatov screamed, his voice cracking with a horrifying ecstasy. "It's active. Secure the asset. Get me the biological component. I want it alive." They didn't just want the weapon. They wanted the key. They wanted him. They wanted to chain him back to their doomsday machine. The truth crashed down on me with the force of a tectonic plate shift. The Soviets hadn't just lost a weapon. They had lost its warden. He wasn't a beast nesting near their prize. He was its bioorganic key, its guardian, its failsafe, a being either engineered or bound to it in some way I could never comprehend. His entire existence, his vigil, his silent communication, it was all to warn me, to show me. The star charts in the snow, the way he watched the northern sky. He wasn't a castaway. He was a prisoner of war, holding the line in a conflict so old I couldn't even guess at its origins. Humanity had built a weapon that required a soul to operate it, and then had been so careless as to lose them both. My quiet life, my penance, had been a lie. I was not a hermit. I was the unwitting neighbor to the apocalypse, and its architects had just broken down the door. My atonement demanded more than just hiding. Kurchatov's men began to advance, their movements no longer cautious, but greedy. They were moving to capture him, to chain him, to turn him back into the slave of the machine. I looked at him, my friend, standing before the glowing green console, and for a fleeting second, he turned his head and looked directly at the ledge where I hid. Our eyes met across the chaos. There was no fear in his gaze, only understanding. A final, silent acknowledgement. The promise we made 42 years ago in the snow, a promise of mercy, was still valid. It was my turn to deliver it. I could let them take him, and in doing so, hand them the leash to a monster of my own creation. Or I could honor our bond. I could give him peace. I could finish the job I had failed to do in Leningrad. My hand tightened on the detonator. Some doors must not only be kept shut, they must be bricked over, and their location erased from memory. I didn't hesitate. I twisted the handle and slammed the plunger down. There was no thunderous explosion, just a series of deep, sharp cracks that echoed from the peaks above. It was the sound of the mountain's bones breaking. The roof of the cavern, a billion tons of ancient ice and rock held in a delicate balance, groaned. A fine powder of snow drifted down, then chunks of ice, then boulders. I saw Kurchatov's face, the ecstatic greed turning to pure, uncomprehending terror as he looked up. He screamed orders that were swallowed by the growing roar of the collapse. The last thing I saw was my friend. He did not run. He simply stood before the glowing green console, a silent sentinel at his post, as the roof of his world came down to grant him his final, peaceful rest. The avalanche was not a weapon of my anger. It was a tomb, a final, merciful blanket to cover the sins of my species. The mountain was taking its secret back. I scrambled away as the entire face of the ridge gave way, a colossal wave of white that erased the cave, the soldiers, and the weapon from existence. The roar faded, replaced by a silence so profound it was like the birth of the world. He was gone. They were gone. It was over. And in that ringing silence, the final truth settled upon me. My defection all those years ago wasn't an escape from guilt. It was a failed mission. I had been a young, arrogant scientist who tried to sabotage Project Svarog from within and failed. I ran not to atone, but because I had been beaten. The mountain did not grant me penance. It granted me a 42-year reprieve. It gave me a second chance to finish the job. My entire lonely life here, our entire silent friendship, was just a long, quiet prelude to this single, violent act of redemption. My real atonement wasn't the isolation. It was this. The cost was everything I had come to love. The mountain is silent again, but it's a heavier silence now, weighted with the memory of a king and his buried kingdom. I am truly alone. Some doors should never be opened. That much is true. But the greater truth is that humanity cannot resist building them. We forge keys of impossible cruelty and then give them to beings we don't understand, hoping we'll forget where we buried them both. My life is almost over. This recording is my final report, my last confession. The story is no longer my burden alone. It is now yours. Occasionally, on the quietest nights, when the wind is just right, I think I can feel a faint, low hum vibrating up from the glacier. deep beneath the ice. A heart that refuses to stop beating. Or perhaps it is just the ghost of a promise, echoing in the cold. Thank you for bearing witness with me. The truth is a fragile thing, and stories like this are all that keep it from being buried forever. If you believe this account deserves to be preserved, I ask you to please like this recording, subscribe to this channel so others may find it, and share it with someone you trust. The official story will be one of a training accident. You now know the truth. Stay vigilant, and please, watch the next story recommended on your screen. There are more secrets buried in the silence, waiting for a voice.